Hello, everyone. My name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to another episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. This episode is called Gary versus the Greys. This is the story of one man's lifelong experiences with Grey-type ETs. This has not always been a pleasant experience for Gary. Gary is a pseudonym. He does not want his real name used. But he's had many encounters with Grey-type ETs. It's quite an extensive story, and I would really like to share it with you today. Gary was born in 1969 in Cumbria, England. Cumbria is a very rural and picturesque area. It's often been called one of the most beautiful areas of England. Unfortunately for Gary, he was born into a very abusive family. His grandparents were abusive, and so were his parents. His father left home at a very young age when Gary was just a young boy, and Gary was left alone with his mother and grandparents. And his earliest memories are of pretty severe physical and emotional abuse. Also, along with this, Gary started having quite a few UFO experiences. His first encounter occurred around age 5, maybe 6, and he was outside in the backyard with his grandmother when a UFO flew by. Even at that age, Gary could see that this was not a helicopter or a plane or anything he recognized as conventional. He turned to his grandmother and said, "What's that?" And she was clearly baffled by it, but didn't want to talk about it and just sort of dismissed it and said, "Oh, it's just the moon." And Gary could see that this wasn't the moon, obviously, but he had no one else to turn to for information, so he just dropped the subject. But it wasn't long after that when they had another encounter. On this occasion, Gary had gone on a vacation with his mother and his mother's new boyfriend, soon to be Gary's stepfather, and they were returning from this vacation where they had driven across England. And it was late at night. They were in the car driving along a rural area when a UFO showed up and started to pace their car. It was sort of this saucer-shaped object. It came down very low, treetop level, and paced their car for many miles, for over an hour, Gary says. Gary's soon-to-be stepfather was baffled by the sight of this object and just telling everyone to ignore it. Gary's mother was pretty upset. She didn't know what it was and kept asking what it could be. Again, Gary's soon-to-be stepfather said, just ignore it, don't look at it. Gary, however, was very intrigued by it and stared at it as it paced their car for over an hour before finally flying off. And this is when his experiences really began. Following this, Gary would go to bed, and at some point in the night, he would wake up to find these weird figures in his bedroom. This scared him pretty badly, and now he recognizes them as Greys, but back then he had no reference point. As Gary says, and I quote, "I wouldn't be in bed long when I used to see these little creatures come into my bedroom. I used to scream in panic and leg it out of the room, much to the amusement of my mother and stepfather. They looked like Greys, but I never remember them taking me." I think it's probably likely that he was abducted at this age. He has no memory of this, though. He does remember that they came over and over again. It was always very frightening for him. His parents were not supportive in the least, so he really had no recourse, nobody to turn to. It was around this time he started having really extensive out-of-body experiences where he would float around his room or around his house in the neighborhood or out into outer space. Even at that age, Gary didn't sleep much. He sleeps maybe 2-4 hours a night. This is something I've heard from a number of contactees who say that they just don't need much sleep. At any rate, Gary feels that his out-of-body experiences and UFO experiences are somehow related, and I agree. I know many contactees who are also having experiences with astral travel. So at any rate, this went on for a number of years, from age 5 to 10 at least, but at some point did stop. As a teenager, Gary often stayed away from home. He enjoyed going to the zoo. He had a real affinity with animals, as many contactees do. But as soon as he reached legal age, he got out of that house, out of that abusive situation, and started living on his own. At that point, he immediately started thriving. He made a number of really good friends. He met a girlfriend, a lady who he would soon marry. He got a job, and things were going great right off the bat. But he was about 19 years old when he had a very scary experience. At that time, he was an avid biker, and he had had a few accidents, woke up in the hospital, and one evening he woke up and he thought he was in a hospital, but he wasn't, because there he saw this gray ET hovering over him. He had no idea what it was. He'd never read anything about UFOs, had no reference point to it, but he knew that it wasn't human. As Gary says, and I quote, "I remember the first time vividly, like it was yesterday. I woke up a little disoriented. It was dark. My eyes adjusted to the light overhead, and as I started to get my bearings, I realized something wasn't right. I was lying on an operating table. The surface was cold and hard, and I was in real pain." At this point, he saw this gray ET hovering over him, and it held a very large needle. It was several inches long, and it proceeded to place this needle into Gary's temple, causing intense pain. Gary protested, he screamed, he began cursing, stop it, you're hurting me." But this gray ET showed little compassion and just carried on without any concern over Gary's well-being. As Gary says, "Like a vet ignoring a yelping dog, it carried on regardless, never acknowledging me once. It had a job to do, and that's what it was doing. As it continued to insert the needle deep into my temple, I passed out, and that is all I remember. The next morning, I woke up a little tired and disoriented with a bad headache. I got up, went to the toilet, and looked in the mirror. To my horror, there was a red mark, a wound, on my left temple. I didn't know what to think. I was horrified, terrified." This was such a traumatic experience for Gary that he didn't tell anybody. He barely acknowledged it to himself. He pushed it to the back of his mind and refused to think about it because he couldn't explain it. The idea of aliens was something very new to him. Again, he's never read anything about UFOs or aliens, and he wasn't about to start. He just didn't want to think about it. He told nobody. It became his own very private, dark secret, and he just would not think about it. Shortly later, he got married. He found a job at a warehouse. He had a son, and things were going great. But it was not long after this first incident when he had another very strange experience. At the time, Gary lived in a 2-story house, and he had to go down the stairs to reach the bathroom, which was on the far side of the kitchen. And this was something he had to do a couple of times a night because he had had an accident as a child, and he needed to go to the bathroom several times during the evening. And so he woke up and decided he needed to go and walked down the stairs, and to his shock, he saw a figure in his living room. It was very short, bald head, large dark wraparound eyes. It was a gray ET. He had pushed his childhood experiences into the back of his mind, as well as this other experience where he had been on board a UFO. So this was a real shock to him. He saw this gray ET, and it had its head bent down, and it looked like it was almost praying or something. But he didn't quite realize what he was looking at. As Gary says, "I recoiled back. I was shocked. I had no clue what the hell it was or what it was doing there. You have to remember, I lived in a very rural part of the country. Things like this don't happen to people like me in places like this. And that is all I remember about that, as I passed out. I barely had time to take a breath. I truly have no idea what happened to me or where it took me after I passed out. When I woke up, I was back in bed. So again, Gary did not talk about it. He didn't tell his wife. He just pushed it to the back of his mind and refused to think about it. But it was only 2, maybe 3 weeks later when he had another very strange experience. He was lying in bed when he kind of felt something in the room. So he had the blanket over his face at the time. He pushed the blanket away from his face and got a real shock. There was a woman, a female, staring at him only inches away. For a second he thought it might be his wife, but he realized instantly that his wife was still lying in bed next to him. At this point he jumped up and screamed as this lady floated up to the ceiling and through the ceiling and out of the house. As Gary says, I shot up in bed. I truly thought I was going to be robbed or murdered. I shot up shouting. Surprisingly, the woman jumped as much as I did. She stood back and quickly floated up and through the roof. Gary looked up at the roof and he could see this weird swirling pattern where the lady had disappeared through. By this point, his wife was awake and was asking him, what's going on? What's wrong? And he pointed to the ceiling and said, look, look. She looked up, but by this time, the ceiling had returned back to normal. And he said, I think I saw a ghost. I don't know. It was very strange. This lady was very attractive. She looked very young, but was wearing this weird suit, this sort of tan, not a jumpsuit, but very similar to it. It had no wrinkles on it. It looked almost brand new. And he was just very puzzled by this experience and decided it must have been a ghost. He was very rattled by it, so he and his wife got out of bed, even though it was the middle of the night, and went downstairs, made a pot of tea, and talked about it. They decided it must be a ghost. But it was only 2, again, maybe 3 weeks later that it happened again. Gary woke up and was shocked to see that there was this woman, or a very similar looking woman. This time she wasn't staring at him, she was staring at his wife, again from inches away, just staring at her, even though she was asleep. Gary shot up and stood on his bed, at the foot of his bed, and looked at her for just a few moments. He was completely shocked, had no idea who this woman was. And after just a few moments, he reached out and touched her shoulder, put his hand on his shoulder and said, "Hello, what's your name?" And the woman completely freaked out. As he says, she nearly shite herself, is what he said. She reached out both her hands, put them on Gary's chest, and pushed him down onto the floor, then quickly levitated up and flew through the ceiling. Gary, of course, screamed, and Gary's wife woke up and said, "What's the matter?" And Gary explained what happened and said, "This woman came back again. I think I saw this ghost again." Only this time, he wasn't really convinced it was a ghost because she had actually pushed him over. This was very upsetting to him. His wife was very supportive, but also very confused. And he had no idea what to think of it, or who this lady could be, or what was going on. Interestingly, it was just either that morning or a few days later, they were listening to the television news when a television reporter came on and started talking about people who were being abducted by aliens. And he described the aliens as looking like Pamela Anderson, the television actress, the very attractive television actress. And that really threw Gary for a loop, because he had to admit that the figure he saw was a very attractive young woman. And he wondered, could she be an alien? He had never thought of ETs as looking like people, but again, he knew nothing about this subject. He'd never read any books on this, had never looked into it at all, and really didn't know what to think about what was happening to him. So once again, he just sort of pushed the subject into the back of his mind and refused to think about it. But this became increasingly difficult for him because he was still having experiences. It was about 1 year after this that he woke up and he was on board a UFO. And this time there was a gray ET standing there in front of him, and it was talking to him. And it asked him, "What do you want to do with your life?" This was not a scary experience. Gary says it was very much like just going to visit a doctor or something. And he was having a pleasant conversation with this gray ET. And he was pretty thrown by the question. He didn't know how to answer it, so he just kind of made a jokey answer. The gray didn't laugh or anything, did not seem to be amused, and that's really all he remembers about that. But he's pretty certain he was on board a UFO. It was very bright. He couldn't see any lights, but the walls themselves were glowing. It was very clean. And this gray ET was very much like the one he had seen before. So at this point, he pretty much knows what's happening to him, but he just doesn't want to think about it. He didn't tell his wife. He didn't tell his friends. He told nobody. And again, just tried not to think about it. But it was not long after that once again he woke up in the middle of the night, and he was not in his bedroom. He was on board a UFO, and in fact he was in a very strange situation. It was very unpleasant for him. He woke up and found himself inside this large tank filled with liquid. He was able to breathe in this tank even though he was entirely submerged with liquid. And even more upsetting was his wife was right next to him, and she was very upset. They were both awake, both fully conscious, and breathing this liquid. And she was very frightened and kept asking him, what's going on? What's going on? Are they going to hurt us? Because there were gray ETs standing up on this sort of ledge, this sort of railing, looking down at them as they were submerged in this tank. And he did his best to assure her that everything was going to be fine, that they wouldn't be hurt, though he himself was not at all certain about this. He did not know what was going on. It was all very disorienting for him, for both of them. And another weird thing that really concerned him was he didn't only see gray ETs, he also saw what looked like military personnel watching over him. So yeah, this was a very upsetting experience for Gary. As he says, and I quote, "I can't put into words how I felt. I realized my wife was with me. We were both naked and huddled together like two trapped animals in the corner of a cage. She was awake also, and terrified. We were in some sort of clear liquid, as clear as water, but we could breathe in it. There was nothing around us, and it was a very large tank, several feet deep, with clear sides all around. And as we looked up, we could see gray aliens on a walkway to the right, about 5 feet above us, just staring down and observing us. There were 3 tall ones and 2 short ones." And even more upsetting were these 2 human-looking figures. They looked very much like government personnel to Gary, like CIA agents or something. They were just coldly observing the whole incident and taking down notes on what looked like some sort of a pad or electronic device of some sort, and showed no emotion, showed no compassion about what was happening to Gary and his wife. The next morning, Gary remembered all of this perfectly, and his wife did not seem to remember. He asked a few questions about how was your night, did you dream anything? And she showed no sign of remembering anything. So he did not tell her, and again just filed this experience in the back of his mind and did his best not to think about it. This was the only way he could really cope with this at this point. So the experiences just kept happening one after another. It was around this time, 1994, that he was outside his home when he saw a huge, absolutely gigantic cigar-shaped object move over his home. It was much, much larger than his house itself, and it was very low, treetop level. Scary says, it went slowly over our house. It was only a few hundred feet up and is the biggest movable object I have ever seen in my life. It blotted out the winter sky and never made a sound. And that turned out to be his last encounter, or so he thought, because following that, all these weird events just stopped. He had no other memories of waking up on board a UFO or seeing grays in his bedroom or in his living room or anything like this. All these ET experiences just stopped. They still had paranormal experiences. Gary still had a lot of out-of-body experiences, which were actually becoming more extensive. He found himself not only flying around his neighborhood and his home, but going up into outer space, visiting the moon, and even slipping off into other dimensions, which he found very hard to describe. But these were pretty much normal for him. And another thing that they both experienced were premonitions. This happened quite often, that they would have premonitions of little things or disasters or all kinds of events in their life. This was much more pronounced for Gary's wife than it was for him, actually. She often had premonitions of things that would occur and was apparently very, very psychic. And Gary as well, though to a lesser degree. So for many, many years, that was all they experienced, and he thought that ETs were gone from his life. But at some point, they came back. It was about 22 years later, in the year 2016, they decided to move out of Cumbria to the city of Carlisle. This is a fairly large city. It's a picturesque city with a rich cultural history stretching back hundreds of years. It's got a strong military presence. They moved into a small village outside of the city, found a home on a cul-de-sac, which was perfect for their little family. And they had no sooner moved all their stuff and settled in when the ETs came roaring back into their life big time. And how it all started was Gary woke up one evening and felt the covers being pulled off his bed. His eyes snapped open and he looked around him and there was nothing in his room, but something or someone was pulling the covers off his bed. And as soon as the blanket came off, Gary found himself floating upwards, levitating. He was unable to move. He couldn't stop it. And suddenly he was just whooshed, went right out through the window and up into the sky. And that's all he remembers. This was an entirely physical experience, not an out-of-body experience. He's absolutely convinced he was fully conscious and fully awake. And it wasn't long before it happened again. This started happening every couple of weeks or so, over and over again. And he knew what was happening. He was pretty sure he was being abducted by aliens. But again, he didn't know how to handle it, who to turn to, what to think. So he just dealt with it by not thinking about it, denying it, and he didn't tell anybody. But it wasn't long after this, or actually it's while this was occurring, that he had one of the strangest experiences of his entire life. He woke up and he was on board a UFO. He could tell instantly because the walls were rounded. It was very well lit. And what was really strange is there was a woman on top of him. He had no clothes on, and neither did she, and they were having intimate relations. And this really shocked him. He had no idea who this woman was. She was very attractive, looked maybe 19 or 20 years old. And as soon as she realized he was awake, she immediately got off of him and sat down next to him. And they started talking. And he's like, "What's going on?" He started cursing. He's like, "Oh my God, oh my God." And she said, "Just calm down, everything's okay. You're not going to be hurt. You're fine, you're fine." And he had the impression that this was absolutely a totally human woman, but that she had lived her entire life on board this craft. And she was super excited to talk to him because he had the impression that this was something that had never happened before, that she had never had the opportunity to talk to anyone. And she seemed very interested in him. And they were just starting, he had just settled down and was getting his bearings, looking around him, and she kept trying to stop him from looking behind him. In front of him, he could see a open sort of doorway, and there was a corridor, and to his incredible shock, he saw two gray ETs walking by. They appeared to be very absorbed in their own conversation. He was so shocked he actually let out a curse word, and the female he was with said, "Shh, be quiet, don't say anything, just ignore them, and they won't bother you." And so Gary calmed down and started to look around him, and he wanted to look behind him, and this woman said, No, don't look. But he turned around behind him and looked and got an incredible shock. He absolutely could not believe what he saw. As he says, "Though I only saw behind me for a few moments, I remember what I saw vividly. The place we were in was enormous, more of a small warehouse than a large room, and everywhere you looked, the floor was filled with bodies, some lying still, others writhing about in pleasure, both men and women. The feeling I got was I really, really wasn't supposed to see this." He had the impression, that these people were being intimate with each other. He's not sure how many people were there. It had to be at least 50, possibly as many as 100. It was a very, very large room. And this upset him pretty bad. At this point, the woman grabbed his hand and quickly led him to another opening that he hadn't noticed at first, and pulled him into this tiny little room, which was longer than it was wide. It had little weird-looking sinks in there and what appeared to be some sort of toilet. And she tried to calm him down and just tell him that everything's all right. And so he started asking her questions. And he asked her, "Why are you doing this?" And she got kind of a sad look on her face and said, "I'm not allowed to tell you." And he started peppering her with questions, asking her all these different things, and she refused to answer any of his questions, just evaded every single question he asked. And he was only there for a few more moments before he blacked out, and the next thing he knew, he was back in bed. So this was a very upsetting experience for him, even though it really wasn't, painful or anything. It was quite disconcerting, especially seeing so many people on board this craft doing what looked like reproductive type behaviors or experiments. So he wasn't quite sure what to make of it, but it certainly gave him the impression that a lot more people are being taken than most people realize. So more experiences came after that. During this time, he and his wife were experiencing all kinds of paranormal activity in their home. They had doors opening and closing, lights turning on and off. They heard weird footsteps. They had 2 dogs. They had several pets. Gary loved animals. But they had this apparition of a dog that kept going through their house. Many weird experiences. He saw a weird sort of apparition of this spider-like creature. Saw all kinds of weird shadow people. His wife saw an apparition of a lady dressed in old-fashioned clothes. Probably the scariest experience was something that happened at least 3 or 4 times, which involved this very large lizard-like creature which would scuttle across his wall. He says it was 2 or 3 feet long and looked very much like a giant lizard with a dragon-like face. And he had the impression it might be some sort of demonic creature or something. At any rate, he didn't like it. It was very scary, and he wasn't sure what to make of all this paranormal activity. I mean, once they came downstairs and all the burners on their stove had been turned on. It's very strange and inexplicable, and they had no idea what was causing this activity or what was going on. But it was a lot for them to take. In 2016, he had another encounter, and this one was very strange. He had woken up with the need to go to the bathroom. And again, this was a 2-story house, and he had to go downstairs to get to the bathroom, and had walked downstairs, and to his shock, there was a gray E.T. But this time, instead of being surprised and just standing there doing nothing, he reacted very quickly and ran up to this gray alien and wrapped his hands around its neck and started choking it. As Gary says, and I'm quoting, "I grabbed it by the throat. In a single moment, 1,000 thoughts went through my head. I remember thinking, how surreal. I've got some creature from another world by the throat. What the hell do I do now?" Its skin felt cold, firm, and leathery. It was a split second, because then its spindly little arms were spinning around like windmills, desperately trying to get rid of me. It was screaming in my head, "Get off of me! Get off of me! Get off of me now!" At that point, something approached him from behind and sort of banged him on the head, and he blacked out. And the next thing he remembered, he was back in bed. So again, he has no idea if he was abducted or what happened, but he was absolutely certain he was awake, and he had choked this gray E.T. Not the first person I've talked to who has reacted violently to the appearance of a gray in their home. So at this point, Gary could feel them coming. There would be a weird energy in the room, and often he would be paralyzed, but even that started to wear off. He could feel them coming, and they were no longer able to paralyze him. So he wasn't sure why that was the case, but he could absolutely sometimes feel them coming. One time he could feel them coming, woke up, and to his shock, a gray E.T. was pulling his wife out of bed. She was standing up, the grays were surrounding her, and he was really mad. It's one thing for him to be taken, but it's quite another for them to take his wife. And he was pretty upset and tried to stop them, at which point they said, "Just go to sleep, go to sleep." And he tried to wake up, but was unable to. He felt himself being pushed into unconsciousness, and he fell asleep. When he woke up the next morning, he remembered this, but again, his wife had no memory. So still, he was keeping all of this secret and did not want to talk about it. And the experiences continued. In 2018, he had another very, very unusual experience. He woke up and he was on board a very, very small craft. It was just this tiny little round room. It was mostly transparent. And looking out, he could see that they were flying over this landscape. There were 2 grays sitting in little seats in front of him. They had their backs turned to him and were operating this console, apparently flying this tiny little 2-seater craft. He was standing up behind them and became fully conscious. And he was so shocked he didn't say anything. He just kind of looked around and enjoyed the view as they were flying over this sort of desert landscape, which reminded him of perhaps the Mojave Desert or He wasn't sure really where it was, but he just stood there and watched this for about 10 minutes, maybe 15, until he became curious. It was clear that the Greys had no idea that he had become fully conscious. So after about 10 minutes, he decided he was going to take some action, and he blurted out quite loudly and out loud, "All right, lads." And their reaction was instantaneous and actually really quite amusing to him. As he says, and I quote, "The shock it caused them was instant and amazing. It's the only time I've ever seen one lose their cool in any way at all. They literally freaked. One of them in particular, the one sitting to the right. I got the distinct feeling it was very young or immature. It got out of its seat and proceeded to run wildly back and forth from left to right in the small space between us. It just wanted out of there, to get away. I stood there watching this thing and thinking, talk about role reversal. This thing was seriously freaking out, and I couldn't help myself. I started to laugh." So Gary talked out loud and said, it's okay, don't worry, I am not going to hurt you." This one young Grey continued to freak out, and the other one remained silent and unmoving. So Gary repeated himself. He said, it's okay, don't worry, I'm not going to hurt you. Everything's fine." And the Grey that was sitting down and apparently flying this craft replied nervously, "Okay, but please just stay where you are. Please just stay where you are." Gary had stopped laughing at this point, but he was still very amused. And he said, "Don't worry, I will. Don't worry." And they continued to fly for a short distance and then stopped the craft apparently over near his home. And at that point, they both got up out of their seats and approached him and told him that this had never happened to them before. Nobody had ever woken up while they were returning them back to their home. And Gary started asking them questions. He asked them, "Why do you do this to people?" And Gary got a very strong impression of sadness, and one of them replied, "We are not allowed to tell you." And then Gary asked them, "Can you let me remember being taken?" And again, Gary felt this wave of sadness coming from them. And they said, "No, we can't. We're not allowed." And Gary said, "Well, who am I going to tell? Who would believe me anyway?" They made no response. And that was all Gary really remembered. The next thing he knew, he was back in bed. And he woke up and had no memory of this event at first. It was about midday when it suddenly just, he remembered. This memory came sliding back into his head. He started laughing at the absurdity of it and the memory of these Greys freaking out. And it was really quite an amusing event for him. And it was a few days after that that he remembered more. He remembered that this UFO had actually come out of some sort of underground base and then flew across this desert area, which he believes is perhaps in the United States. He's not sure. He just had that impression that it was like the Mojave Desert area, this kind of desert area. And that's all he recalled. And this was perhaps the most pleasant and amusing experience that he had had with these Grey ETs. But overall, most of his experiences have not been pleasant. And it was a few months later, actually in 2018, that he again felt their presence. He could feel the energy of them coming. And this energy increased and got stronger and stronger until he was quite certain that they were in the room. And so he waited until he was sure that they were standing next to the bed. And this is when he took action. As he says, and I quote, I waited until it had pulled the covers right back, and I punched it in the face. And I can tell you now, they may look small and cute to some people sometimes, but this thing suddenly changed. It was furious. It hissed loudly and lunged for me. Its face changed. Suddenly it looked nothing like a gray. It looked like something completely different. Its small, narrow mouth went from a tiny slit to a wide, gaping thing with spiky teeth. It was something that, in all intent and purposes, seems to try to come across as innocent, frail, and harmless, but in fact has the teeth of a predator for gripping, shredding, and ripping. And when I punched it, it was like its mask slipped for a moment, revealing its true identity. I shot up in bed. I thought I was going to die. I threw my fist right back. I was going to punch it through the wall. I thought I was fighting for my life. At this point, he passed out. He wasn't able to punch it again. But this was, the second time that he reacted very violently towards these gray ETs who were appearing in his home. And it was interesting that he described short, spiky teeth, because this is something I have heard from other abductees. So that, in a way, for me at least, was verification that his experience was real. And this was very hard for Gary to talk about. He wasn't very forthcoming at first, but only after he got more comfortable with me did he start sharing more and more of what was happening to him. And I was interviewing him actually as these experiences were ongoing. So this was a very active case, a very active investigation. And this same sort of thing happened again a few months later. He woke up, he could feel them in the room, and he was getting ready to lash out. He was going to kick them this time. But this time they were ready. As soon as they pulled off the covers, they immediately knocked him out before he could kick them. So they came prepared this time for his fear and his violent tendencies to attacking them. So more weird experiences happened. And the next year, in 2019, he woke up to go to the bathroom and was in the bathroom when about 10, maybe 20 little orbs of light came swarming into the room and swirling around him. And he was very shocked and slowly backed out of the bathroom and returned to his bedroom and again tried to ignore what was happening to him and forget about it. At this point, it was impossible. These experiences were so numerous that he was constantly thinking about them. He still didn't want to read about UFOs. The whole subject made him very uncomfortable. And he just doesn't want to talk about it. But his experiences continued. It was a few months later that he was in his bedroom when suddenly this bright, bright light came shining in through the window. He thought at first it might be a car, even though he knew it wasn't, because his bedroom did not face the street. It was impossible for light to come in that brightly. And as he's watching, suddenly this huge orb of light, the size of maybe a grapefruit, comes into the window, and it's very bright. It lights up the whole room, and suddenly it lets out this really bright flash of light. There's a loud bang, and he's knocked unconscious. He feels like they probably did it that way because he was in their bad books for sort of attacking them the way he did. So Gary is not happy about his experiences. He thinks that abductions are probably much more common than people realize. And in fact, he thinks perhaps they're very widespread. As he says, and I quote, "I honestly think nearly everybody is abducted. It's like a cattle market. The difference is most people simply have no idea, don't remember, and never will. It's just the odd, unlucky person, or lucky, I suppose, depending on your outlook, like myself, that occasionally does, for whatever reason. We are simply no more than lab rats to these things. I've spent most of my life trying to block all of this out. I think that's what they want you to do, the tossers. But now I've gotten through that mental block. The genie is out of the bottle. So yeah, it hasn't been pleasant for him. He had another experience around this time where he woke up on board this craft, and again, the same tall gray ET was piercing his temple with a needle. It was very painful, and again, the Greys seemed to show no compassion. Another time, his young son, woke up and there was all these scars all over his back. That freaked them out. They healed very quickly, but they had no idea where these scars came from. Gary kind of knew that it probably had something to do with ETs, and now it was not only affecting his wife, it was affecting his whole family. And this is when he decided to tell them. He said it would be much easier if he was diagnosed with schizophrenia or something. Or he said it would have been easier to admit to being a serial killer than telling his family or his wife, he did not tell his son, what was going on with him. In fact, he got himself really drunk, and that's when he told his wife that he thought he was being abducted by aliens. And he spilled out pretty much the whole story. There was a few encounters that he was just too embarrassed to talk about to her. And she was, to her credit, very supportive. And she knew he wasn't the type of person to lie. She could see he was totally serious. He was very emotional about it. And he came clean. And yeah, she was absolutely 100% supportive. And Gary felt like a weight had been taken off his chest. And it was not long after that he told his best friend what was going on. And his friend had heard of UFOs and abductions and was also very supportive. So for the first time, Gary felt a huge sense of relief. And he also spoke with me and shared all his encounters. He felt it was important that people know this is going on. And he thinks, yeah, a lot of people, if not everybody on Earth, is being abducted. It's just that most people don't remember. And he does not like the Greys. He feels like they do not treat him kindly and that he's being used, and is not happy about these experiences. So that's kind of why I wanted to do this video, to let people know that there's a wide variety of experiences that people have. I told Gary's whole story in my recent book, Onboard UFO Encounters. It's one of the longer cases in this book, and I think was really important for people to know about. And Gary's experiences are still ongoing. Last I've talked with him, he's still having experiences. He saw another UFO over his home. He's still being pulled out, levitated out of his bedroom, and presumably into a craft. He doesn't remember most of the time what's going on in these situations. But yeah, this case is still ongoing. And my heart goes out to Gary, and I certainly hope his relationship with the Greys improves. But at this point, it's not something he would wish upon anybody. And that's the story of Gary versus the Greys. I want to thank you very much for watching and listening. I really appreciate your support. And just want to thank you again. And until next time, keep having fun.